ministers. The Greens leader, Richard Di Natale, is in that camp. He hasn't even had a chance to get to estimates hearings today with so many back-to-back meetings. The government's eager to get its budget bills through, and it's showing plenty of interest in Senator Di Natale. He's pretty keen to stay at the negotiating table if there are acceptable deals to be done. Well, Richard Di Natale, a few weeks into the job, ministers seem fairly determined to get off on the right foot with you. Are you feeling the love?
Oh, well, I wouldn't call it love, but we've had some pretty constructive discussions. Obviously, my job is to stand against those budget measures that are going to make life more difficult for ordinary people, and to where we can find some common ground to work with the government and to try and get an outcome for people. And there are some areas, I think, where we might be able to do that.
OK, well, let's talk about some of those in a moment. But just on the general dynamic, what is it, like a steady stream of ministers coming to you with their pet projects? Or what are you experiencing?
I wouldn't describe it as a steady stream, but I've certainly met with the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, Finance Minister and so on. And the discussions have been frank. There are many measures in this budget that the Greens won't support. There are measures that make life more difficult for ordinary people. But where we can get a decent outcome for people, they're my jobs to make sure that we do that we put the politics aside and we get those budget measures through, as few as they are, that actually make life better for people.
And do you think there's an appreciation on their part that you are a negotiator?
I do. I think they've, the proof will be in the pudding in the end. So far things are going well. But the sense I get from, as I said, from the Prime Minister, the Treasurer, the Finance Minister, is that they are prepared to talk. Really, the ultimate test will be whether we can get things done and we can get measures through that make life better for people.
OK, well, let's go to some specifics about what I assume they are talking to you about. Family tax benefit B, so critical to the child care package. Now, we're seeing reports that the government may be up for some movement. It cuts out at 16 currently. They wanted it to cut out when the youngest child turns 6. Do you see room for movement to meet in the middle somewhere?
Well, the disappointing thing about that measure is that they've linked what is generally a good measure, those childcare reforms on the whole are positive, and they've linked these changes to family tax benefit B, which means that single mothers, people on low incomes will be worse off. We don't like that. Changing the age doesn't fix that. Changing the threshold at which it kicks in doesn't fix that. There may be some other areas as part of family tax benefit B where some of the measures are not well targeted and are addressed more at high income earners that we'd be prepared to look at. I think really just fiddling.
What is that? Sorry, that's a tighter means testing? Or?
There's the opportunity to look at means testing to make sure that the means testing is tighter around family tax benefit B. That's one area that we're looking at the moment. I'm concerned that simply fiddling around with the age at which the support kicks in is not the best way of addressing the unfairness in that change.
But would it be less onerous, less punitive if it was allowed to continue until the youngest child was, say, 8 or 10? Or
it'd be a small improvement on a bad policy. Now, it makes a bad policy a little less bad. That doesn't mean that it's worth passing in and of its own right. The thing that's really disappointing, Greg, is that there are so many measures that this government could implement. For example, superannuation tax concessions, we know would bring in, and the Greens have costed a policy at $10 billion, and we wouldn't need to do this. We wouldn't need to punish single parents. And that's part of the discussion I've had with the government.
But presumably it's hard for you to dial that one in when you're seeing the public statements of the Prime Minister saying no adverse changes this Parliament, no adverse changes next.
And so there are other areas. There's the area around diesel fuel rebates for mining companies. We've had those discussions. The government, I think, is reluctant to look at that. There are other savings measures I've put, again, to members of the government. But
publicly disclosed?
Not yet, no. Things that I've been working on, and I'm.
Any hints? Clues?
No hints just yet. But there are areas I think we can achieve savings. We can't, though, continue to ignore the issue of revenue and huge tax concessions to the big end of town, and then we're forcing this change through family tax benefit B, which is effectively punishing single parents, making it harder for them. And I don't think we should support one measure, a good measure like childcare, but do it at the cost of punishing single parents.
And how's the timeline on that? Do you sense urgency? They're obviously keen to get a lot of budget stuff through as quickly as they can, even though childcare doesn't begin until 2017. But how quickly do you think some of these deals could come together if indeed they do?
It's hard to know. I mean, we have also discussed the issue of pensions and making the pension system fairer. Some of the suggested changes in the budget we're prepared to look at. We want a broader income review. I'd like to think that we could do that quickly, but really it's in the government's court at the moment.
Okay, now the old one that you're always asked about, and I guess you're going to be asked again by the government as well as the media, automatic petrol excise indexation. If the revenue is not going to roads, does that take away one of your big obstacles to this?
It improves it, but there are a couple of things. If you're still building roads and not providing people with alternatives, then a pollution tax doesn't work. You've got to provide people with alternatives for it to actually result in behavioural change. So we're looking at ways that we can perhaps introduce measures for that, which we will put to the government.
Behavioural change?
Well, for example, public transport options. There's room for negotiation. If the government's open to it, we've said we're open to looking at that change, providing we can deal with some of those aspects. What we won't do is support the change as it currently stands. And if the government wants to give the money back to the big oil companies, well, that's their decision.
Right, but that one is in play from your point of view, and you've put these submissions.
We're having discussions with the government about some of the things that are of interest to us. Now it's a question of having more detailed discussions. And to work out whether the government's got an appetite to look at providing those public transport options, looking at dealing with some of those regressive impacts. And if we can get some agreement on where that is, then there's a possibility of getting some sort of agreement.
All right. Look, another one that's sort of in the daily news cycle was the Treasurer going for backing in, I suppose, the idea of some GST reform, trying to exempt, if you can get states to agree, women's sanitary products. This is a hangover from 15 years ago with the Democrats. If this did come forth in the form of a bill, how would the Greens stand on that?
Oh, well, it should never have been included in the first place. And it's a shame that, it took an appearance on an ABC program for this to come to light, and suddenly we're getting policy change. This should have been dealt with years ago.
And you're glad that it is?
Yes.
All right. Richard Di Natale, Greens leader, thank you.
Good on you. Pleasure.